Greetings on this Tuesday, January the 28th, 2025. Welcome to the Daily Article Podcast. I'm Chris Elkins, narrating today's daily article written by Denison Forum co-founder and CEO, Dr. Jim Denison. Teresa Regula arrived at Auschwitz as a 16-year-old. Once a healthy child, she contracted chickenpox, measles, and scarlet fever in the horrific Nazi concentration camp. Speaking ahead of yesterday's 80th anniversary of Auschwitz's liberation by Soviet troops, she said, "When I returned from the camp, I thought, I'm never going to have children, ever. If they are going to go through even a fraction of what I went through, I didn't want that." Though she later married, she has remained childless all her life. Having visited the Holocaust Museum in Israel and several U.S. cities over the years, I know I cannot begin to imagine the horror of the atrocities inflicted on the Jewish people by the Nazis. 1 million of them were murdered in Auschwitz, 6 million in total. A fourth of the victims were children. I would imagine that many of Hitler's Jewish victims knew Psalm 22, David's famous prayer of lament. They, of all people, would have the right to pray its opening words in verses 1 and 2, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest." David goes on in this psalm to describe his suffering in detail. From verses 7 and 8, "All who seek me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him." From verse 16, "They have pierced my hands and feet." Also verse 17, "I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me." And in verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, for my clothing they cast lots." And yet, we know from verses 3 and 4 that David refuses to abandon his belief in the goodness of his God. "You are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them." Now comes the hard question. What do we do when God does not deliver us? What would David say to the victims of Auschwitz? One Jew in particular especially had the right to ask our question. Jesus made David's initial lament his own cry from the cross in Matthew 27, verse 46, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His death on Calvary fulfilled Psalm 22's descriptions in stunning detail. Matthew 27:43, his enemies mocked him with the exact words of Psalm 22, verse 8. "They have pierced my hands and feet," from Psalm 22, verse 16, is a graphic depiction of the crucifixion, though the Persians did not invent this horrific form of execution until 4 centuries after the time of David. From Psalm 22, verse 17, "I count all my bones." Before Jesus' executioners could break his legs to hasten his death, as was typical, we read in John 19, verses 30 and then 33, that he gave up his spirit. And Psalm 22, verse 18 says, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." This was precisely how Jesus' executioners stole his clothing, as we read in John 19, verses 23 and 24. Crucifixion was one of the worst forms of torture ever devised, and yet Jesus refused to drink even wine mixed with gall to dull his senses, choosing to experience the cross in all its excruciating pain, according to Matthew 27, verse 34. What's more, his sinless soul was made to bear the sin of all humanity across all time, affirmed by Isaiah 53, verse 6, and 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21. You and I have no possible way to imagine the horror, disgust, and grief this must have caused him. Even worse, the Holy Father was forced in that moment to turn from his sin-bearing Son, causing Jesus to cry out in agony at having been, quote-unquote, forsaken by him. In total, Jesus suffered physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual pain on a level no other human has ever experienced. And yet, somehow, in Luke 23, verse 46, he found the faith to pray at the end, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." How How can we do the same? I have no simple formula to offer Holocaust survivors or those devastated by the wildfires and now the floods and mudslides in California, or Ukrainians continuing to suffer from Russia's immoral and illegal invasion, or anyone else facing the tragedy and pain of our fallen world. However, I have made two discoveries over the years that I find deeply encouraging in my hardest days. First, when all is well, it's easy to trust in the God we credit for our success. When He answers our prayers in the ways we want Him to, it's easy to have faith in Him. But when our days are painful beyond despair, when our suffering knows no release and our grieved questions have no answers, those are the times when we most need an omnipotent Father. But He cannot give what we do not have the faith to receive. And so it is when we find it hardest to trust Him that we most need to trust Him. It is when we are the sickest that we most need a doctor. Of course, it is in such times that faith can be hardest to choose, which leads to my second observation. My lack of faith is God's invitation to seek the faith He alone can give. One reason God allows us to come to the end of ourselves is so we can turn to Him for the faith we cannot muster up ourselves, a faith that our circumstances can neither warrant nor produce. Then we can cry with the demoniac's desperate father from Mark 9, verse 24, "I believe, help my unbelief." I once heard a pastor say, "When you don't have faith, pray for the faith to have faith." We can ask our Lord to help us believe that His omniscient ways are higher and better than ours, asserted by Isaiah 55, verse 9, that the God who is love can only want our best, affirmed in 1 John 4, verse 8, that the Father who redeems all He allows will redeem even this, whether we understand His redemption in this life or the next, established in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12. Carolyn Curtis James observed, "Joy isn't grounded in our circumstances. It is grounded in the unchanging character of God." Will you choose joy today? Listeners like you support Denison Forum's mission to deliver news discerned differently. As a ministry nonprofit, we are fully donor supported. To partner with us, please donate today using the donate link in our show notes.